Welcome to the debate. Today, we're really plunging into what I think is one of the most critical challenges of our time, this collapsing commitment, the widespread burnout, and the rise of technology-facilitated addiction that seems to be defining the digital generation. It just feels like the capacity for sustained motivation is, well, it's diminishing rapidly.
It really is. And the central challenge for us today is figuring out the true source of this crisis. I mean, are we looking at a collective internal psychological failure, a kind of developmental crisis of character and purpose? Or are these symptoms just overwhelmingly driven by a toxic external environment that's saturated with these hyperstimulating, what we call supernormal stimuli?
That is precisely the crux of it. So, we're debating, does the root cause of this crisis in motivation lie primarily in these internal developmental psychological failures, or is it overwhelmingly driven by an engineered external environment? I'll be arguing that the failure is fundamentally internal. It's centered on our psychological frameworks, particularly this refusal to accept ordinary life and cultivate purpose.
And I'll be focusing on the power of that external architecture. I think there's an evolutionary mismatch between our ancient brains and modern tech that, systematically hijacks our neurobiological reward pathways. It makes sustained internal discipline an uphill and sometimes an impossible fight.
Look, the fundamental issue from a psychological perspective is what really looks like an active refusal to accept the responsibilities of adulthood. This behavior is brilliantly captured in the Jungian archetype of the puer aeternus, the eternal child. And this syndrome, it manifests not just as immaturity, but as a deep inability to make lasting commitments, a continuous longing for a perfect, unachievable fantasy life, and a profound reluctance to engage in the tedious, the drab, dreary work that just defines necessary adult endeavors.
And I think the environment creates the perfect preconditions for that puer to thrive. But before we dive too deep into the internal state, I think we have to recognize the foundational context here, the brain's evolutionary mismatch. The human nervous system, it evolved to operate in a low-stimulation environment. Today's screens and platforms, they're not benign. They are relentlessly engineered to be highly engaging, to constantly feed us novelty and activate our reward centers in a way we are biologically just unprepared to handle.
Wait, let me just elaborate on that internal mechanism first. The core issue of the purists is this demand for a guaranteed return before they're willing to pay any cost. They are constantly waiting for the perfect job or the perfect partner or the perfect opportunity. And this results in what we call moratorium, a state of continuous exploration without ever committing. They stay paralyzed by this fantasy of future potential, terrified of wasting time on work that might not pay off, which ironically leads them to waste time indefinitely through their own indecision. This reluctance creates a massive internal vacuum.
Right, and I would argue that vacuum is instantly and powerfully filled by this engineered environment. The core issue here is the desensitization of our brain's reward circuitry. Chronic, hyper-rapid consumption of what we call supernormal stimuli. I mean, think of the instant, high-potency novelty on certain internet platforms, or the endless, perfectly rewarding loops of video games. It trains the brain to seek more and more extreme stimulation. Purpose, or the lack of it, that's the inner scaffolding. And without that scaffolding, the vacuum that's created is the core vulnerability of all addictions. It allows the engineered quick fix to just rush in and fill that void.
I agree that the digital fix fills the void, but the key point is the psychological source of that void. When people avoid internal conditioning, the slow, hard work of developing competence and relatedness, they're left vulnerable. That lack of internal purpose is what invites the external escape. Purpose isn't something you find externally. It has to be internally crafted through choices that exercise self-control and stretch our existing capacity. When that internal defense is absent, the environment seems overwhelmingly powerful.
But the neurological consequences of this are severe, and they often precede the psychological symptoms. This desensitization is why we see such high rates of downstream effects, things like clinical anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure in real-life activities, and even physical dysfunctions like porn-induced erectile dysfunction or delayed ejaculation. The brain's dopamine sensitivity is just decreased so sharply that ordinary, low-key real-world rewards, like completing a difficult task or even having a conversation, they simply don't register anymore. These resulting emotional and psychological problems like depression and social anxiety, they aren't the initial cause of the reliance on technology. They are fundamentally the neurological effects of chronic environmental disruption.
That's a powerful explanation of the symptom, but let's get back to the psychological mechanism of the paralysis itself. Even if the environment offers this high-octane stimulus, the true engine of paralysis remains that internal psychological avoidance. The puer's fear of commitment because it cuts off possibilities is the dominant thought pattern. They are paralyzed by the fantasy that they are meant for more than, say, stacking boxes or doing any kind of routine, low-status work. It's an internal ego inflation that keeps them stuck in this self-inflicted limbo, right? Believing the ordinary is beneath them.
I appreciate the focus on ego, I really do, but when the brain itself is being rewired for maximum intensity, the environment is it's actively reinforcing that avoidance by making real-world engagement physically unrewarding. I mean, consider sexual novelty. It's a massive driver of dopamine release, linked to the well-known Coolidge effect, where mammals seek new mating partners for renewed sexual interest. Okay, so now, via tube sites, this novelty is hyper-accessible. It drives the brain from 0 stimulation to 140 kph in seconds. This artificial high sets an impossible, unconscious expectation. So when real-life attempts to engage, a slow date, a meaningful but arduous project, it just cannot meet that high dopamine standard. The result isn't just a fear of commitment, it's a physiological inability to find real life rewarding enough to commit to, because the baseline expectation has been completely skewed.
I understand the neurological power of that skew, but the question remains, why does that environment hook certain people so much more effectively than others? This high-stimulation environment, it only gains its traction because of pre-existing psychological needs frustration. Clinical research suggests that problematic digital use arises when an individual's attempt to satisfy crucial psychological needs, autonomy, competence, or relatedness, is rebuffed or rejected in the real world. It is not merely the loneliness, but the frustrated attempt to connect or achieve that then turns the individual toward digital content as a readily available coping mechanism. They're trying to reduce their negative feelings that stem from that prior psychological wound. The internal vulnerability creates the demand for the external supply.
I'm just not convinced that focusing on a prior psychological wound accounts for the systemic nature of the problem, especially when you factor in the structure of modern life, which ensures systemic exhaustion. This exhaustion, it actively undermines any attempt at sustained internal discipline, making the environment overwhelmingly powerful. We live in a society that glorifies constant work, where the whole concept of the weekend only exists to give institutions license to absolutely chew through us during the week. We accumulate an exhaustion debt. If you're not waking up daily back to 100%, you cannot sustainably love the grind or maintain the necessary cognitive load to fight these highly addictive, expertly designed systems.
That's a compelling argument about the societal pressure, but we have to distinguish between real, overwhelming societal stress and the self-appeasement that follows a failure of discipline. The solution to feeling deconditioned or exhausted isn't always external systemic change. It is what I call reconditioning. We have to accept that the natural human state involves meaningful engagement, and we have to build discipline as a tangible skill, similar to strengthening the inhibitory circuits of the brain, the frontal lobes, through sustained practice like meditation or deliberate boundary setting.
Hold on, can you elaborate on that? I mean, how does this seemingly small boundary, like just putting your phone down, how does that translate into the kind of frontal lobe strength you're talking about? One capable of overriding years of high dopamine conditioning.
Certainly. Inhibitory control is like a muscle. When you decide, for example, I will not take my phone into the bathroom, or I will sit silently during this break instead of immediately opening an app, you are demanding that your frontal lobe exert cognitive control over the impulsive limbic system, which is seeking that immediate reward. These small, seemingly drab commitments build a foundational tolerance for boredom and frustration. This psychological conditioning increases your mental resilience making you less reactive to the lure of the screen when genuine stress actually hits. It's the micro commitment that builds the macro capacity.
But focusing purely on internal strength ignores the immediate, overwhelming influence of conditioned environmental cues. We know addiction pathways are intensely sensitized. Environmental triggers like the sound of a phone notification or just the act of lying down in bed are incredibly powerful because they instantly release dopamine, firing up those pathways. These are physiological responses, and they bypass conscious thought. Regaining control requires immediate, uncompromising environmental countermeasures. We have to employ external restraints, like relocating online devices to less private, more exposed locations, the living room, not the bedroom, or using extinction training, similar to how we train Pavlov's dogs, to actively weaken the automatic link between the cue and the habitual dopamine-driven response. If we ignore the environment, the internal battle is just overwhelmingly difficult because the brain is literally optimized to respond to the trigger.
I agree environmental control is a vital first step, but the most profound and lasting transformation, it relies on resolving the underlying internal conflicts that made the individual susceptible in the first place. Things like paralyzing self-loathing. Self-loathing, even if it's rooted in justified failures, is internalized anger that prevents effective action and commitment. So the key psychological lever is cultivating awareness, a deep, non-judgmental understanding of one's own internal emotional state. Clinical experience shows again and again that a lack of this awareness is what causes those vulnerable to addiction to relapse the moment stressors inevitably rise. If the focus is solely external, you're merely treating the symptom of the addiction, not the psychological wound that opened the door. True, sustainable recovery means moving beyond relating to the external mask of competence and finding the authentic self through this difficult internal work.
You emphasize the destination, the authentic self, but I maintain that the initial requirement for successful recovery is fundamentally physiological. You have to give your brain a rest from all artificial, hypersexual, or novelty-driven stimulation for several months to restore the reward circuitry's factory settings. You just can't ask a person suffering from anhedonia to find purpose. Their brain it's literally incapable of properly registering the small joys that constitute purpose.
See, that's where I have to challenge the purely physiological perspective. I mean, how can you ask a psychologically vulnerable person, one who is already suffering from self-loathing and a fear of commitment, to endure several months of grueling internal work if they are also experiencing a profound loss of reward sensitivity and often withdrawal symptoms?
You are right that it is grueling. This process involves enduring significant physiological withdrawal symptoms, including the infamous flatline, a temporary, complete loss of libido, and general emotional engagement. This has to be endured, sometimes for many months, precisely to allow the brain's dopamine sensitivity and natural libido to reset. The high-intensity brain pathways override conscious choices. Without that strict external restraint, the hyper-aroused system simply prevents any deep internal psychological work from taking root. You must first facilitate physiological rest, a neurological reboot, before the self-loathing individual even has the capacity to feel the small rewards necessary for purpose building.
I see the necessity of the reboot to achieve a kind of neutral baseline. But even after that baseline is achieved, purpose isn't automatically granted. It's still a deliberate psychological choice. My concern is that focusing so much on the external cleanse suggests that returning to the factory setting solves the puer aeternus issue, and it doesn't. You may have the ability to feel pleasure again, but the psychological reluctance to commit to ordinary life, the fear of failure, the ego inflation, these structures remain and have to be resolved through internal awareness and action.
And my counter concern is that asking a person who is chemically desensitized, trapped in a functional anhedonia, to find internal purpose is like asking a car with a dead battery to drive. You could talk about the destination all you want, but you first have to restore the power supply through external means, the physiological reboot, to even start the internal engine of choice and commitment. The brain pathways have to be functional before the will can be effective.
So it seems we agree that, effort and commitment are required, but we
We really disagree on the necessary sequence and the primary leverage point. The psychological failures, the avoidance of commitment, the refusal of the ordinary, the pursuit of external validation, these remain the primary leverage points for addressing modern suffering because the digital environment is exploiting the absence of that internal structure. We must focus on cultivating purpose and reconditioning the self to handle the realities of work and life, and that requires internal will.
And I maintain that the neurological impact of the modern environment is just too profound to be overcome by sheer willpower alone, especially given the engineered power of supernormal stimuli. We have to recognize the fundamental physiological reality of reward pathway desensitization. The necessity of strict abstinence and environmental control, the rebooting process, is the non-negotiable prerequisite to allow the brain to heal before any sustainable internal growth can begin.
This discussion really highlights a critical feedback loop, whether the psychological void invites the addiction or the addiction induces the psychological void by altering the reward system. We can't address the crisis by prioritizing one domain entirely over the other.
Indeed, recognizing that the environment itself is designed to challenge our evolved biology forces us to be strategic. The path toward reclaiming control in this hyper-stimulating world requires blending that profound psychological fortitude and purpose-finding with necessary physiological rest and rigorous external boundaries. There is always more to explore in how we adapt, both neurologically and psychologically, to this new digital frontier.